I guess, Jordan Peterson last week. He made a video called The Truth About Communism, and it's just standard anti-communist malarkey, but it got about 600,000 views in 6 days. Huge viewership for this very short, pack of standard anti-communist gibberish, with philosophy and self-help mixed into it. So actually, I'm going to follow Tyler's suggestion, and I'm actually going to debunk the Jordan Peterson video for the first little bit of our opening remarks tonight. So we're going to start about 3 minutes into it, because at the beginning he just is kind of rambling, and we're going to get back to what he says at the beginning. We're going to start out just 3 minutes into the video. So I'm going to pull up Jordan Peterson, and we are going to talk about Jordan Peterson's anti-communist lies.
Even now, because it's like the 100th anniversary of the Russian Revolution, or celebrating Lenin, it's like, that's not good. That's like celebrating Hitler. Okay, I'm dead serious about that. It's not good. And the fact that people can dare to think that that's okay means that there's something wrong with the way that we look at history. Lenin was a monster. And if you want to know about that, you can read Solzhenitsyn's writings about Lenin. Because the communist apologists say, well, it wasn't Lenin. Lenin was a good guy. He was all motivated by love of the working class. It's like, well, his henchman was Stalin. And if your henchman is Stalin, you're not a good guy. and Lenin was around during the early collectivization.
What was the early collectivization? What was this early collectivization? He's like, Lenin was around during the early collectivization. What was the early collectivization? What was that? I'm sorry. I'm someone who's actually studied the history of the Russian Revolution, of the Bolshevik Party, of the Soviet Union. What was the early collectivization? What was it? I'm curious. I've never heard of any event in Soviet history called the early collectivization. The collectivization of agriculture took place in 1931, 32, 33. That was when you had the countryside of the Soviet Union transition to collective farms, the elimination of the kulaks as a class. That was in the 1930s, long after Lenin died. Lenin died in 1924. So what in the world is he talking about with the early collectivization? What's he talking about? There is no such event called early collectivization. He might be referring to war communism. And that was immediately after the Bolsheviks took power. They took power in the Russian Revolution, October of 1917. They took power. After they took power, 15 different countries invaded Soviet Russia. It wasn't even the Soviet Union yet. It was Soviet Russia. 15 different countries invaded. And so they militarized everything. And until 1921, they fought off foreign invaders combined with domestic opponents in an all-out civil war. The British sent their troops in there and seized the oil fields of Azerbaijan that were the property of the Rothschilds and other oil banking families. The Americans, there were American soldiers that were sent over. There was a division of fighters from Wisconsin who actually joined the Bolsheviks. They got over there and they switched sides. A lot of them had been wobblies, and they actually switched sides. U.S. Marines were sent to the Soviet Union. If you go to the Marine Corps Monument, they have a list of places U.S. Marines have been sent. And one of them is Soviet Russia, not the Soviet Union, Soviet Russia, because immediately after the Bolsheviks took power, they sent the U.S. Marines over there. There was a blockade, and they couldn't get medicine. And the country was surrounded and barricaded. And under these horrendous circumstances, the Bolsheviks implemented military communism or war communism, meaning that they rationed everything for the military effort because they were under siege and they were fighting for their lives. And thousands of people were dying because they couldn't get medical care and they couldn't get food. And the country was in a state of utter turmoil, as every major country in the world, Germany, France, Britain, the United States, all of the major countries sent their militaries in to try and crush the Bolshevik Revolution. So, what is he talking? What is this early collectivization that he's talking? What in the world is he talking about? Is he talking about the Bolsheviks fighting for their lives and implementing military communism? Is he talking about how after the Russian Civil War, After that, they implemented the new economic policy and allowed, free markets to flourish. They said, peasant, enrich yourself, and we're promoting private farming. What is he talking about? The early collectivization. Nobody calls it that. You can tell this guy doesn't know anything about what he's talking about. He's just, but he assumes that you are stupid. You, his audience, are stupid. He assumes you've never read any economic history of the Soviet Union. All he's ever read is Solzhenitsyn, which is, that guy's a religious czarist, who just, was against the Bolsheviks and anti-Semitic and a lot of awful things and sympathized with Franco and fascism. But he writes these kind of religious moralist critiques of socialism. But you can tell Jordan Peterson has no clue what he's talking about. There's no such event as the early collectivization. There's the Russian Civil War. There's military communism. There's the new economic policy. None of those things are called the early collectivization. So right off the bat, you should know this guy has absolutely no fucking clue what he's talking about. There is no, he's talking the early collectivization. That sounds all hoity-toity, doesn't it? Sounds such a, I read all about the early collectivization. He has no idea what he's talking about. So let's just be clear about that. He has no clue what he's even talking about. Let's continue.
And if you read what he wrote, you'll find out that he is perfectly willing to have any number of people die as long as his ideological system could be brought into being. So there's no celebrating Lenin. There's no we're cool, young, Marxist, hip revolutionaries, and he's our idol. It's like, there's none of that.
He says he didn't care how many people had to die in order to implement his ideological vision. And how many people had to die in order to prevent his ideological vision? Why was there a barricade set up, so that no food or medicine could get in? Why did the Bolsheviks have to beg the Red Cross and Quakers and others to come in and bring medical volunteers? And why did Winston Churchill say that they were going to go strangle the Bolshevik baby in the cradle? Why did all these countries that had fought each other in World War I suddenly unify to attack the former, the Russia after the Russian Revolution? Why was Russia put under these horrendous circumstances? Why was the White Army, going through the Russian countryside, slaughtering entire Jewish villages and exterminating people on the basis of their race? I'm sorry, but it's like the immediate aftermath of the Russian Revolution, in which you had a country that was already in the middle of a huge imperialist war. World War I was an utter nightmare. And the conditions on the Russian front, where the Russians were fighting the Germans, where there was mass desertions because the Russians didn't want to fight. And the conditions were so bad. And then you add to that the Bolsheviks, on a platform of peace, land, and bread, took power, promising to end the war, to redistribute the land, to feed the hungry people. And so then immediately every foreign Western capitalist power invades to try and crush them. Is all of that Lenin's fault? Are you blaming that on Lenin? And is it any surprise that under such circumstances, the Bolsheviks may implement very strict military discipline, which they did, right? They outlawed the drinking of alcohol. They outlawed opposition parties. They even outlawed, factions within the opposing parties because they were under attack and fighting for their lives. They were surrounded. They were being attacked. They were being crushed. And under such circumstances, you can't just be free and open and democratic and do whatever you want. Under such circumstances, you're going to have military discipline. And they did. And the Bolsheviks, in order to survive, in order for the Soviet Union to survive under such an onslaught that had never been seen before, they're going to have to become strict. But what did they do under those circumstances? Well, one thing is immediately after the Bolsheviks took power, women got the right to vote. They didn't have the right to vote in the United States or in Britain at that point, that they got the right to vote. They got the right to vote in the Soviet Union. In addition to that, what did the Bolsheviks do? They published all the secret treaties that the Tsar had signed, the Sykes-Picot Agreement that divided up the Middle East. They exposed how the imperialists had divided up and carved up the Middle East as they were fighting World War I. They exposed the documents of the Tsar's secret police and how they had infiltrated the revolutionary movement. In addition to that, you saw land redistribution. In addition to that, you saw, efforts to bring people into the governing process. So even as they're being surrounded and attacked, they're empowering women. They're exposing the lies of the imperialists. And the Bolsheviks even offered military support to the emir of Afghanistan. The leader of Afghanistan was fighting the British Empire. And so Lenin offered support, military support, to the Afghan Muslims to fight the British. They convened the Conference of the Peoples of the East in Baku, Azerbaijan, and said, we will support anyone who fights the Western colonizers. The British imperialists had been slaughtering people in Africa and Central Asia and in South America and the Caribbean for so long. And immediately, even though they're surrounded and being barricaded, and even though people are dying, even though they're fighting a war for their very survival, they're empowering women to vote. They're convening anti-imperialist conferences and bringing people from around the world together and announcing they offer military defense and military support to anyone who fights the British Empire. Immediately, they're doing good stuff amid everything that they were up against. These are dark years. One of the translations of the Soviet national anthem, it says, "Through days dark and stormy, where great Lenin led us." These were awful, awful times, no doubt. The time when Lenin was the leader of the Soviet Union were pretty awful. But they were awful because the entire world was trying to crush what the Bolsheviks had created, and they resisted it. And they had to have very authoritarian mechanisms to do so. And it was bleak and it was hard. To just blame it on Lenin's personal ego or something like that is kind of missing the point. But let's continue.
Not if you know anything. Not if you're decent. Well, there was the death of the kulaks, I told you about that. There was the Ukrainian famine, that's 6 million gone there. There was the rise of the Gulag state, because it turned out that Russia, the Soviet Union, couldn't run on the principles that it had laid down as sacrosanct. They just didn't work.
Well, first of all, let's be clear that it wasn't a Ukrainian famine. There was a famine all throughout the USSR. All right, the Soviet Union, they had defeated the foreign invaders. They had the new economic policy in the 1920s where they were empowering private farmers. And there was grain shortages and there was hunger. And so in a situation where you had grain shortages, a bad harvest, they sent in the military to create a collective farm system. And it was through the collectivization that you got tractors with which to run modern farms. And it was through the collectivization that you got the modern farming system, the first modern farming system in the history of Russia. Russia had never had mechanized agriculture before. They had individual plots. They'd never had big, huge farms that could put out huge amounts of crops. And if you look at it, the collectivization was very difficult. And the famine that happened in the 1930s, early 1930s, was very horrendous. And you can argue that some of their policies, definitely contributed to the harshness of the famine. You can make that argument. But it was as a result of the collectivization that Russia got a modern agricultural system. Capitalism had been in Russia for quite some time, and under the Tsar, there had been mass starvation and famines routinely. People had been dying of, hunger every year. There was famines every year before the Bolshevik Revolution. People died of malnutrition in the Russian countryside all the time. And they were, operating their farms with horse-drawn plows. And they didn't have electricity. And they didn't have running water. And it's because of the Soviet Union and Stalin's 5-year economic plans that they got tractors to work their fields, that they got running water, they got electricity, they got modern apartment buildings to live in, not huts that they shared with their animals. I'm sorry, but if you look at the conditions in the Soviet countryside and you compare what they were before the revolution to what they were afterwards, it doesn't even compare. Running water, electricity, modern housing, literacy. The Bolsheviks wiped out illiteracy. And it was the Soviet Union that ended the famines, for Christ's sakes. These famines happened all the time before the Russian Revolution. People in the Russian countryside, people in the Ukrainian countryside, they all were starving to death all the time. And no one cared. It was just a fact of life. Well, that's what peasants do. They starve to death. If there's a crop failure, their landowner gets his share. And if there's not enough left over, you're fucked, guys. You starve. That was just how things were. And notice that there's no body count for that, because that's just natural. That's just normal, right? That's not, we don't talk about, the Russian capitalism that was genocidal. We don't talk about feudalism as a genocidal system. Oh, no, that's just normal. But the Bolsheviks come to power, and through coming to power and breaking out of Western capitalism, they industrialize, They wipe out illiteracy. They electrify the country. They bring running water to the country. They almost double the life expectancy. And they mechanize agriculture. So they have a modern farming system so they can, for the first time, actually feed the whole country. Huge achievements are happening, but none of that counts. But because there was a famine in the process, even though there were famines long before, even though the Bolsheviks are the ones that cured the famine, somehow that famine discredits the entire socialist project. I mean, that is what you call a selective interpretation of events. I'm sorry, what was the Soviet Union like before the Bolsheviks took over? And what was it like by the mid-30s after the first 5-year plan had been completed? I'm sorry, who electrified the entire country? Who wiped out illiteracy? I'm sorry, these facts, you can't just say, oh, there was a famine and that's the whole story. No. There were famines all the time. They cured the famines. That's the story. And that's why the whole world was marveling about what they were doing. Read what the New York Times had to say about them. Read what Albert Einstein had to say about them. Read what Time magazine. The whole world was having a Great Depression. And the Soviet Union was plowing ahead with rapid industrialization. They were raising people out of poverty. They built a modern educational system. None of this matters, right? It was just a big famine, But continue, Jordan, continue.
Slave everybody and run your economy as a slave state, essentially.
So he's saying that the economy of the Soviet Union was run on gulags. You do realize there were less people by both numbers and percentage in the gulags than there are in American prisons right now. Now, is prison labor a part of the U.S. economy? Yes, it is. But do we have a prison economy? Would you say we have a slave labor economy? No, most people in the U.S. workforce are not in prison. And most people in the Soviet Union were not in prison, right? Were there gulags? Sure. And that's bad. And a lot of people who were in the gulags didn't belong there, according to even everyone's account. So I'm not going to defend the fact that there were people who shouldn't have been in those gulags who were put in them, right? In the Great Terror, Yezhovshchina was a nightmare. And we don't deny that. And no one's trying to say that conditions were good in the gulags. But I'm sorry, but by numbers and by percentage, the number of people in the gulags was far lower than the general population and far lower than prison population in the United States is even now. So you can't call it a slave economy. You can't call it that because, I'm sorry, the majority of the work in the factories, the majority of the work on the collective farms was not being done by prisoners. So that, just because they existed, just because there was prison labor in the Soviet Union does not mean the entire economy was based on that. I'm sorry, some things are true and some things are not. And if you're going to call that a slave economy, you better call the United States a slave economy, because at least in the Soviet Union, in those gulags, they were working for the state. They were working for the government. In the American prison system, you're working for Victoria's Secret. You're working for AT&T. You're working for private companies who get away with paying pennies an hour because they've got an in with the government and they can use prison labor. They can pay you less than the minimum wage. If he wants to complain about prison labor and the use of prison labor, why is he not complaining about what's going on in the United States right now? Because it's a far bigger aspect of our economy than it was in the Soviet Union. Yes, gulags existed and people in those gulags did labor. That is true. But compared to what exists in the United States right now, the amount of prison labor in the U.S. economy is much bigger. It's much more of a factor. And it's for private companies that are enriching themselves and using the government to have slave labor. I'm sorry, these are facts here. So, if he's going to go about, it's a slave labor economy, American capitalism is far more of a slave labor economy by mere numbers and percentage. There are far more prison laborers, people in prison being forced to do work in the United States at this time than there were in the Soviet Union. The conditions in the United States are probably much better. I'm not denying that. The gulags were awful. I'm not defending the gulags, but I'm just talking about facts here. I'm sorry, but if you're going to say that the existence of prisoners doing labor makes it a slave economy, then by definition, America has a much bigger slave economy than the Soviet Union did. But let's continue.
Try not to kill the people in the gulags so fast that you can't suck some productive labor out of them. There's the death of tens of millions.
Okay, most people who went to gulags survived. The gulags were not death camps. The gulags didn't have gas chambers in them, right? Hitler had gas chambers and had death camps. Most people who went to gulags were in there for a couple years and then they got out. A lot of them were there for normal crimes like murder and theft and rape and there were political prisoners as well, and that's not good. And, the Great Terror of 1936-37, you can read many accounts of what went on, and it wasn't good. But most Gulag prisoners didn't die there. They were not death camps. I'm sorry, but it's like, I mean, that's not what the Gulags were. There's Nazi death camps where they gas you, and then there's prison labor camps in the Soviet Union. Both are bad, but you can't equate them.
People, we don't even know. The estimates range from 15 to 60 million. And we won't get too picky about the numbers, because after the first 10 million, you kind of made your point. And the fact that we don't know between 15 and 60 is actually an indication of the horror of it.
You notice no one ever comes up with a body count like this for capitalism. The British created a man-made famine in Ireland that killed millions of people. In India, the British Empire, with their free trade system, killed millions of people in India. World War I, that happened just before the Russian Revolution, was 20 million people. 20 million people dying in a battle between the great imperialist powers, the United States, Britain, France, Germany, Austria, battling for carving up the developing world, right? So, that's 20 million right there in just a few years. You read about the Battle of the Somme, where it was like 100,000 people dying in a day. I mean, let's do a body count for capitalism. How many people died in the colonization of Africa? How many people died in the transatlantic slave trade? How many people died? How many Native Americans were there when Columbus arrived compared to how many there are now? Right? Let's do the numbers. Let's do the math, right? I mean, there's never a body count like this, right? Every person who dies because they didn't have access to proper medical care should be added up into this body count for capitalism, right? The capitalist system began with, slavery, with the killing of Native Americans. It began with, the clearing of the commons, where they turned all the serfs and peasants into wage laborers and threw them off the land. They started executing vagrants. You can talk about the clearing of the Scottish Highlands. That was a genocide where the English went to the Scottish Highlands and cleared out all the Scottish people in the Scottish Highlands. I mean, that was a genocide. I mean, you can talk about all the ethnic conditions that people lived under. How many people died after working their lives in sweatshops, right? People from the countryside would go to the cities and be worked to death in mills and factories. How many people, how many young children worked in coal mines and breathed in the coal dust and died from that? I'm sorry, I want to hear, where's the huge numbers, right? Every single person who died in the Soviet Union of anything, their name gets added to this body count, right? So, why don't we do that for capitalism? If you did that for capitalism, the numbers would be so much higher, but none of that ever counts for capitalism. No, wars just happen. It's not capitalism's fault. Wars just happen. Oh, industrial accidents just happen. Oh, slavery. Well, that wasn't real capitalism. That was slavery. I mean, it's like, this is a ridiculous game that they play, right? And again, all the famines that happened in the Soviet Union are purely the fault of socialism, even though they cured famines, even though famines happen all the time before the revolution. They are the ones who built a modern agricultural system. They mechanized agriculture. They brought the tractors. But none of that counts. No. The famines count as if you actually killed somebody. This is ridiculous. Okay. There you go. All righty, folks. Keep going.
Because our count is off by tens of millions. And that's only within the last...
Yeah, that's because your count is bullshit. That's because your count is completely based on all kinds of things that are not relevant, right? Again, what about all the famines that existed beforehand? What about the fact that they cured the country of famines? What about the fact that they were invaded by 15 different countries? I'm sorry, but it's like, you always get these numbers. Stalin killed 60 million people. Well, if you're in a court of law and you're going to accuse somebody of killing 60 million people, you can't just say, well, they killed them. And this is the game that they play. They say Stalin killed 60 million people. And you say, how did he kill them? How? And they reply, are you defending Stalin? No, it's a simple question. If you're in a court of law and you say Joe Bob is guilty of killing Anne, you have to explain how he did it. Did he stab her? Did he choke her? So how did Stalin kill these 50, 60 million people? How did he kill them? How did he kill them? Oh, well, there was a famine in the Ukraine. Huh. There were famines all the time before the revolution, weren't there? So did capitalism kill all of that? Wait a second. There's a famine. That doesn't, no. So there's a famine, right? Even though there's famines under the capitalist system all the time, even today, all over the world, we're on the brink of a global food crisis because of their insane war against Russia, right? Right now, the Dutch farmers are out there rioting and throwing manure for the right to grow food amid a global food crisis. Sri Lanka was forced by BlackRock to reduce their crop output and go organic, and it's ruined the country. People are starving in Sri Lanka because of the policies of BlackRock and the international bankers that run American capitalism. But this big, huge number you came up with, it's not that Stalin personally shot all these people. No one alleges that. There was executions in the USSR, but that's not what you're talking about. You're saying these big, huge numbers that Stalin killed them because a famine took place on his watch. Yet it was on his watch that for the first time in the history of the Soviet Union, of Russia and the surrounding countries, they stopped having famines. It was on his watch that they electrified. It was on his watch that they wiped out illiteracy, that they electrified, they brought running water and electricity. I'm sorry, but it's like, does he get credit for that? Or no, there was a famine along the way. Some of the leftovers, the starvation, the underdevelopment that went on under the old system, some of that was still existing at the, as Stalin was rapidly industrializing the country. And so that's his fault. No, I don't buy it. Don't buy it. And that's where these big numbers come from, right? The gulags were awful. The Great Terror was awful. There were a lot of people who got executed. There were a lot of people who were in gulags who didn't belong there. But these huge numbers they come up with are based on famines. And famine does not equal murder, right? I mean, we all know what Hitler did. Hitler rounded up people on the basis of their race, because they were Jewish, because they were gypsies, because they were disabled, put them on a train, took them to a place where they gassed them to death. That's straight up murder. And nobody alleges that the Soviet Union ever did anything like that. Never. No one has ever made that allegation, right? At no point has anyone alleged that there were gas chambers in the Soviet Union and they rounded up all the Ukrainians and put them in. That never happened, right? No one has ever alleged that there was gas chambers in the Soviet Union and Stalin said, round up all the Chechens and put them in the gas. That didn't happen. So anyone who tries to equate the Soviet Union with Nazi Germany is lying to you. A famine is not the same as the Holocaust. A famine is not the same as the Holocaust. You think that the Soviet Union had mismanaged their economic policies, that's one thing. But you cannot draw a moral equivocation between economic mismanagement in the process of raising a country out of poverty and straight up ethnic genocide. You can't make that equivocation. I'm sorry. That's just not honest. And he does this because he's a liar. And let's continue.
Century. And then there was the 1956 crackdown on Hungary and the 1968
Hold up.
Czechoslovakia.
Hold up. The 1956 crackdown on Hungary. What was that? Well, there was an armed uprising in Hungary directed by the CIA, directed by fascist sympathizers, so much so that one of the leading Holocaust deniers, David Irving, wrote a whole book glorifying this fascist uprising against communism. And so the Soviet Union sent its military to fight a group of armed US-backed insurgents. I'm sorry, but the crackdown on Hungary, how is that a genocide? I'm sorry. That was a fight, and there were a lot of Hungarians who were on the Soviet Union side in that fight. There were many Hungarians who were pro-Soviet, who took the side of the Soviets. So I'm sorry, but it's just, I'm sorry, how is the crackdown on Hungary, how is that a crime against humanity? That's an armed conflict between US-backed forces that were rallying around, I think, was it Nagy or whatever his name was, and the Soviet Union. That was an armed conflict. So does not compute. Yeah, I mean, it's just, but again, you're not supposed to know anything about it. It's just like the early collectivization. Well, the crackdown on Hungary. It's like, I'm sorry, but when there's a war and there's people shooting on both sides, not a genocide, my friend, not a genocide.
There was the whole thermonuclear Holocaust thing that was going on at the same time, and the fact that in 1962 and in 1984, we were seconds away from complete annihilation, right? During the Cuban Missile Crisis, the keys were in the intercontinental ballistic missile release systems, and Castro, as he admitted to Jimmy Carter, in case any of you are Castro fans, which you shouldn't be, that he was perfectly willing to have Cuba annihilated if it would have meant the defeat of the United States.
Oh my God. Okay, so that one. Yeah. Who got the atomic bomb first? The United States. Who is the only country in the world to have actually used the atomic bomb? The United States. Did the United States use the atomic bomb once? No. The United States used the atomic bomb twice. Did the Soviet Union ever nuke anybody? No. Did the Soviet Union get nukes first? No. Did the Soviet Union ever have a policy of a first strike, a first nuclear strike? No. It wasn't an arms race, as Michael Parenti talks about. It was an arms catch-up, that the Soviet Union was forced to drain its budget with nuclear defense. The USA would point nukes at the Soviet Union and threaten them. And so the Soviet Union would have to get enough nukes that they could retaliate. And then the United States would get more nukes. And then the Soviet Union would have to get more nukes to catch up. And then we would get more nukes. And the arms race was really an arms catch-up, where the Soviet Union was constantly being forced to spend out of its own budget nuclear weapons to deter an attack. Before the Soviet Union had the atomic bomb, the United States threatened to use the atomic bomb on China and Korea. Did you know this? That President Harry Truman fired General Douglas MacArthur because during the Korean War, without asking the president, General Douglas MacArthur threatened to drop 5 atomic bombs on China. That is a fact, right? So the United States was threatening the whole world with atomic weapons. And in response to that, the Soviet Union got their own atomic weapons to deter what they were being threatened with. And then the United States got bigger atomic weapons. And so the Soviet Union was forced to get bigger atomic weapons. I'm waiting for the part where this makes them evil, right? If they had got nukes first and threatened the United States first, there might be something to what he's saying there. But that's not what happened. The United States not only proliferated nuclear weapons, it then used them unnecessarily on Hiroshima and Nagasaki and killed 500,000 people. And then it proceeded to threaten all the socialist countries of the world with nuclear annihilation, forcing the socialist countries to catch up and develop their own nuclear weapons. How in the world, how is any of this the Soviet Union's fault? The whole Cuban Missile Crisis he just referenced. Why did the Cuban Missile Crisis happen? Because the USA, President Kennedy, put nuclear weapons in Turkey and threatened the Soviet Union. So they said, okay, we're going to put nuclear weapons in Cuba. If the USA had not threatened the Soviet Union and put nukes in Turkey, the Soviet Union would never have responded by putting nukes in Cuba. So that crisis was because of the United States. So, and I'm waiting for the part where that means that communism's pure evil, because, I'm sorry, if your neighbor is threatening you and he gets a gun, so you go and get a gun, how does that make you a mass murderer? I mean, it just doesn't add up. I'm sorry. And again, he's assuming that you don't know anything. He's assuming that you're stupid, and he's assuming that you just want to agree with him, that you have a bias, right? Everyone knows the commies are bad. All those woke kids protesting, they're all a bunch of commies, right? Oh, Joe Biden's a commie. He just wants you to be just some dumb bro who doesn't know any of this. I'm sorry, history does not match what he says in this clip, so I will continue.
And then in 1984, approximately, I may have the date exactly wrong, the Russians received an indication from their early warning systems that the Americans had launched 5 thermonuclear missiles, and one Russian decided that it was a mistake and refused to launch the retaliation. And he just died about 2 weeks ago. So, that was pretty close. And so that was experiment number 1, let's say. That wasn't good, that experiment.
Okay, now, just to conclude this issue. So his final example is that in 1984, the Soviet Union was led to believe that they were facing a nuclear strike from the United States. And so they considered retaliating in response to it. I'm waiting for the part where that makes them genocidal mass murderers. The arms race was the result of the United States getting nuclear weapons, using nuclear weapons on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, threatening the Soviet Union with nuclear weapons. And then when the Soviet Union got their own nuclear weapons, the USA got bigger nuclear weapons, the hydrogen bomb. I'm waiting for the part where this is the Soviet Union's fault. The arms race was the doing of the United States. Very, very clearly the doing of the United States. In every conceivable way. I'm sorry, if the United States had not been threatening the Soviet Union, the United States had not used nuclear weapons unnecessarily on Hiroshima and Nagasaki when Japan was already ready to surrender, I'm sorry, but it's like there's no way any of that is the United States. And the fact that he even goes there shows that he's playing on your ignorance. He thinks you're stupid.
Let's put it that way. It wasn't good. It was exactly the antithesis of good.
Really. I mean, hundreds of millions of people lifted out of poverty, a deeply backward country becoming a modern industrial country, illiteracy being wiped out, millions of people getting access to education, space travel being invented, LED lights being invented, the mobile phone being invented. I'm sorry, some things are true. And I mean, he says, oh, it's nothing good ever happened in the Soviet Union. Who saved the world from Hitler? Who took Berlin, for Christ's sakes? Nothing good ever happened. I mean, what about the empowerment of the national minorities and how the Soviet Union went out of its way to make sure that every one of these nations that had been oppressed by the Tsar got their own written language, and they promoted the language of nationally oppressed groups within the Soviet Union. Nothing good happened, right? The whole a country goes from the Middle Ages to modern industrial society in 5 or 6 years, raises hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, wipes out illiteracy. They're doing amazing achievements in the arts like have never been seen before. The work of the work of Shostakovich in music, the work of amazing work like Sergei Eisenstein and his amazing films, the pioneer of the montage, doing stuff in film that had never been done before. Hospitals, schools, modern electricity, a modern steel industry. They're producing more steel than any other country in the world at this point. I mean, none of that counts for anything, right? I mean, a whole country rapidly industrializes. They have the highest rate of GDP growth of any country in the world, but none of that counts for anything. Nothing good happened. The entire time, the Soviet Union was just one big famine. He's a liar.
Precisely the antithesis of good.
Nothing good.
But that wasn't all. I mean, there's the People's Republic of China. That's a different country, like seriously a different country, right?
Yeah, and it's also the second largest economy in the world, thanks to the communists.
Right, different tradition, different language. How many people died in China under Mao? No one knows. Same issue with the Soviet Union, although Mao was a bigger monster than Stalin, and that's impressive.
Based on what?
Because there's Hitler, there's Stalin, and there's Mao. And of the three, Mao was probably the worst.
Based on what? Right? Again, before Mao, they didn't have tractors in China. Before Mao, they didn't have running water and electricity. Before Mao is the one who created modern China, who brought China into the future. It was Mao who created the modern agricultural system. And you throw Mao in there with Hitler. Show me one thing that Mao did that was anywhere near the Holocaust, right? In the Holocaust, Hitler rounded up people on the basis of their race, put them on trains, took them to places where they had gas chambers, death camps, and gassed them to death. Show me one place where Mao did anything like that, right? Even the most harsh critics of Mao, show me one place where Mao exterminated people on the basis of their race, right? No, there was this famine, and no, that doesn't count. There were famines all the time. They used to call China the sick man of Asia. Did you know that? China was the sick man of Asia. People died all the time. Women had their feet crushed. They had foot binding. Women had their feet crushed so, that would make them more sexually appealing. I'm sorry, Mao created modern China. He started China on the course to being what it is today, the second largest economy in the world. Mao created barefoot doctors. There were people in China who had never seen a doctor. Most of China was in the countryside, and they had never seen a doctor in their lives before. And Mao created the barefoot doctor brigades. Go look it up, the barefoot doctors. And Mao sent medical volunteers all throughout the countryside, and all kinds of people, thousands and millions of people in China saw a doctor for the first time in their lives because of Mao. I'm sorry, and again, but some people die. It's like you're missing the forest for the trees. Mao is the guy who started China on the course of becoming what it is today. Mao is the guy who created modern agriculture, brought tractors to China, built power plants in China, wiped out illiteracy in China. I mean, I'm sorry, but the Chinese Communist Party has probably the greatest economic record of any existing political party in the world. There is not a single other political party on earth that can claim as much of an economic achievement as the Chinese Communist Party was. Look what China was like when the communists came to power, and look what it's like now. if that is not progress, if you can't look at that and see success, you are just intentionally self-delusional. I'm sorry. What the Chinese Communist Party has achieved is the marvel of the world, what they've achieved. I mean, it's like economists from all over the world are astounded at their economic success. None of that, none of that gets acknowledged in this kind of hysterical, excuse me there, in this kind of hysterical anti-communist narrative. None of that ever gets acknowledged. None of that ever gets acknowledged. But I'm sorry, but I mean, it's it's this selective interpretation, I mean, if I were to tell you that in all of the United States, nothing ever happened but the Great Depression, if in all of American history, nothing happened but the Civil War, you would obviously say, Caleb, that's not a fair representation of American history. There's a lot more things that went on. There's the Industrial Revolution, there's the Roaring 20s, there's the 1950s, there's the 1960s. You can't just say the whole history of the United States was the American Civil War. You can't do that. And you would be right to make that criticism, because that would not be accurate. And that's what he's doing here. He's summing up 70 years of the Soviet Union existing. He's summing up all of China's history since 1949 as nothing but one big famine and one big execution, one big gulag famine execution. And that is a dirty, nasty lie. And the only reason he gets away with it is because his audience are ignorant and they want to hear it because they hate wokes. And I hate wokes too, but wokes ain't communists, my friend. Wokes are not communists.
Still revered in China. Maybe that accounts for their affinity for North Korea, which could still destroy us all, the remnants of that horrible state.
And again, he's making it sound like North Korea got nuclear weapons for no reason. Did he not notice how the United States killed about 4 million Koreans during the Korean War? Did he not notice that North Korea had a huge rate of industrial growth in the 1960s and 70s? Did he not notice how the USA tried to strangle their economy in the 1990s and wouldn't let them import oil to run their tractors with, and they had a food crisis? And so amid the food crisis, where the United States was just turning on the screws and people were starving to death, they proliferated nuclear weapons as a means of self-defense. Did he not notice that the Bill Clinton administration made a deal with North Korea and said, if you don't get nukes, we will give you all this food and all this heating gas? And then Congress didn't fund the deal, and then Bush made them part of the axis of evil. So then, only then did they get nuclear weapons. I'm sorry, but it's just like, again, like he makes it sound, they could destroy us all. They have nukes. They have been at a state of war for years. 4 million people died in the Korean War. That country is locked down, fighting for its life. The USA has nuclear weapons in South Korea. They do drills, rehearsing an all-out war with North Korea. They've got, foreign troops right on their border in South Korea doing war games every year, practicing an all-out attack on them. And then he says Mao is revered in China. He can't understand why Mao might be revered in China. What was China like before Mao? What is it like now? If you can't notice that, you're just intentionally lying. I'm sorry, but it's like, there's a reason that Mao is admired. Mao started China on the course of being where it is today. Mao's socialism laid the economic foundations for China to become what it is today, the second largest economy in the world. I'm sorry, facts are facts, my friend. You can not acknowledge this all day long, but, there's a reason that Stalin is very popular today in Russia. There's a reason that Mao is very popular today in China, because they both raised those countries up into modern countries. Millions of people got access to medical care because of Mao, because of Stalin. Millions of people got access to literacy and education because of Mao and Stalin. Millions of people got access to electricity and running water because of Mao and Stalin. I'm sorry, these are facts, and you don't acknowledge any of that, but every death that goes on is somehow them personally killing them. This is a fraudulent narrative.
Maybe 100 million people died in China during the Great Leap Forward. That's a hell of a leap forward.
100 million people died during the Great Leap Forward. I'm going to look that up. 100 million people. I'm not familiar with that number, but let's see. 100 million people. That's a lot of people. Great Leap Forward. How many people does Wikipedia, which is hugely biased against China, how many people does Wikipedia say died during the Great Leap Forward? He just said 100 million, right? Now, Wikipedia, which is really anti-China, says between 15 and 55 million. And he is so biased that he took 15 and 55 million and he rounded it up to 100 million. I mean, does any of this, I mean, do you want to talk about dishonesty here? Right? That even the most anti-communist sources don't say that happened. So, I mean, oh boy. I just, 100 million people. I mean, and no one fact checks them on this. And if you counter this, then the response is just, oh, are you defending Stalin? Are you defending Mao? I mean, it's just, I mean, somewhere, I'm looking, Wikipedia doesn't even make those allegations, right? I mean, does this show you how loose they are? If can you trust somebody who says 100 million people died, and most of the other sources don't even say that many? I mean,
maybe it wasn't 100 million, maybe it was only 40 million. But as I said before, when you're counting in the tens of millions, your point's already made. And then there was...
And how many people died as a result of Western capitalism keeping China poor and keeping China from developing? How about the Opium Wars, where China was prevented from having their own economy, and the British invaded them and forced drug addiction and narcotics onto the country in the Opium Wars? The estimates in China, they say it's about 100 million people died as a result of the economic destruction of China during the century of humiliation. Does that count for anything? Are you going to put that on your capitalism checklist? How many people died from the Civil War, where the United States backed Chiang Kai-shek to wage a war against democracy and to try and prevent the communists from being part of the government? How many people died, died in the White Terror, where the USA backed Chiang Kai-shek and waging a purge and trying to, wipe out the communists who've been part of the KMT government? How many people died in the Korean War, where the USA tried to overthrow the Democratic People's Republic of Korea and just waged war on the Korean Peninsula, trying to wipe out North Korea, and China had to send their soldiers into the Korean Peninsula to fight the United States? How many people died in the Tibet Civil War, where after the Chinese Revolution, the USA started airdropping fighters and bombs and weapons into Tibet, and China had to wage a civil war in Tibet where US-backed fighters, the Dalai Lama's own brother, were airdropped, and they burned healthcare clinics, and they murdered literacy volunteers, and they were fighting to keep people in serfdom and keep people in slavery. How many people died in that? Again, he wants to play this game where every person who died in the Great Leap Forward, even though there were famines all the time before the revolution, every person who died in the Great Leap Forward, immediately, the second the communists take power, if they don't immediately solve every problem, it's genocide. And every single person who dies of malnutrition or anything before the communists, after the communists take power, is immediately their fault. And the communists then build up the country and raise it up out of poverty and industrialize it, create a modern agricultural system, feed the people, provide education to the people, create a modern country. Now China has gone from being the sick man of Asia to being the second largest economy in the world. 800, 900 million people lifted out of poverty. But none of that counts. But, hey, during this period, there were issues with the agricultural system. There were food shortages. That's Mao's fault. Mao personally killed all of those people. And maybe it was 10 million or maybe it was 100 million, but who really cares? The point is that communists are evil, and communism never achieves anything everywhere, even though the whole world can see what China has become. The whole world can see how the Soviet Union became a superpower. The facts are right there in front of your face. They are right there in front of your face. The Soviet Union became a global superpower with socialism. It became a modern, electrified industrial country with socialism. China became what it is today with socialism, with 5-year economic plans, with state-run banks. I'm sorry, the facts are right there in front of your face. And he can obfuscate and talk about famines and talk about this, but the facts are right there in front of your face. Socialism very clearly works, my friend. The evidence is right there for anyone to see. When Libya was a socialist country under Gaddafi, people from all over Africa were trying to get into Libya to get some jobs and healthcare and education. And now that Libya has been forced with NATO bombs back into their globalist free market system, now that that's happened, now at this point, Libya is in an utter crisis. There's two governments battling each other. It's an absolute mess. I'm sorry, the facts speak for themselves, my friend. Russia and China greatly benefited from the socialist economic system. It raised the country up. And if you look all over the world today, there are many countries across Africa, across Central and South America that have not had anywhere near the level of development. They've been kept poor by the domination of Wall Street and London.
Cambodia and the killing fields, and Bulgaria and East Germany. And
Cambodia, you mean Pol Pot, who was backed by the United States and armed by the United States to fight against Vietnam, which was aligned with the Soviet Union. You do know the U.S. government armed and supported Pol Pot, and it was communists who overthrew Pol Pot. You ought to read The Revolution Rescued by Erwin Silber. The USA was arming and supporting Pol Pot, and it was Vietnamese communists who removed him. So how is that the fault of communism? When the USA arms an anarchist nut job who's against industrialization, one of these degrowthers in Cambodia, and communists, Vietnamese communists aligned by the Soviet Union, have to remove him. How is that the fault of communism? How's that? I'm sorry, that doesn't add up.
Romania and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, that's North Korea, and Vietnam and Ethiopia, Hungary.
Oh, Vietnam, right? Vietnam. How is Vietnam doing? Why don't you check out what the World Economic Forum has said about how the Vietnamese Communist Party has presided over an economic miracle? Go and read the World Business Forum. They have an article. The World Economic Forum has an article entitled Vietnam's Economic Miracle. What the Vietnamese Communist Party has achieved, raising people out of poverty, industrializing, what they've achieved is massive. In fact, I'm gonna link you my article here in the chat about Vietnam's economic miracle. Vietnam economic miracle. Right? The Vietnamese Communist Party has had huge achievements for the population. Right? I'm going to link you. It's on my website. Vietnam economic miracle haunts U.S.-Korea talks. Right? The World Economic Forum writes, a mere 30 years ago, the country was one of the poorest in the world. How did this Southeast Asian nation grow to become a middle-income country? Vietnam has invested a lot in its human capital and infrastructure. Facing a rapidly growing population, it stands at 95 million. Rapidly growing population. I thought they should all be dying because of communism, right? Half of whom are under 35, up from 60 million in 1986. Vietnam made large public investments in primary education. Wow. The fourth industrial revolution, these investments have paid off. These are facts. I'm sorry, but Vietnam is not a story of communism not working. It's an economic miracle presided over by the Communist Party. Similar for China. I'm sorry, these are facts. The World Economic Forum speaks, highly. Vietnam enjoys a GDP growth rate of 6 to 7% a year. That's huge. 6 to 7% economic growth per year in Vietnam under the Communist Party. How in the world can he say that Vietnam is not an economic success?
Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There was never a successful communist state.
I'm sorry, when has socialism not been successful? It made Russia and the surrounding countries that made the Soviet Union, it made them an industrial superpower, lifted millions out of poverty. It made China the second largest economy in the world, right? I just read to you about Vietnam's economic miracle under the leadership of the Communist Party. The whole world is raving about Cuba's healthcare system and Cuba's literacy volunteers and literacy campaigns and Cuba's educational system. Jonathan Cazal, one of the most well-respected educational scholars in the United States, has written a whole book about the amazing achievements of Cuba's educational system. Nicaragua is doing way better than Guatemala and Honduras are. Guatemala and Honduras both have U.S.-backed free market regimes, but Nicaragua has a socialist government, and their living standards and their education level and their access to health care are far higher in Nicaragua. Where has socialism not been a success? When Hugo Chavez took power in Venezuela, they had only 12 public universities. Now they've got 32. They wiped out illiteracy in Venezuela thanks to the Bolivarian socialist government. I'm sorry, where has socialism not been successful? This is ridiculous.
Cuba, I suppose, came closest, but it was radically... the Soviets poured money into Cuba, so that doesn't really count.
The Soviets poured money into Cuba, so it doesn't count, right? What about after the Cuban government was in power, but the Soviet Union fell during the special period when they were blockaded, and yet they still continued to survive. And they got through that special period of huge, crippling economic embargo from the United States, but yet they still continue to be known all over the world for their medical volunteers. They still built what Ban Ki-moon of the United Nations said was the greatest medical school in the entire world. What about the fact that Cuba is hailed all over Latin America, that Cuba has a life expectancy and an infant mortality rate that's better than most Western capitalist countries, but no, that doesn't count. The Soviet Union gave the money. Well, if the Soviet Union was a complete and utter failure, where did they get the money to build up Cuba? This narrative doesn't fit. He's selectively interpreting history.
So then the first question was, well, are these Marxists motivated by love or hatred? Well, is it love or hatred that produces 100 million dead people? And is that enough evidence or not? And if it's not enough evidence, if you think to yourself, well, that's not enough evidence, it was never really given its proper try. It's like, well, what would have been a proper try? See, I always think when I hear someone say that, I know what you think. You think in your delusional arrogance that you understand the Marxist doctrines better than anyone else ever has, and that if you were the one implementing those doctrines, you would have ushered in the utopia.
He's absolutely right about this part. Absolutely right. I agree with 100% with him. This is why BreadTube is so toxic and dangerous. This is why Vosh and Thought Slime and Abigail Thorne and ContraPoints, this is why they're so dangerous, because he's right about this. Look, if you accept the narrative that communism never achieved anything anywhere, all it led to was death and gulags and 100 gabillion people dying, and they tried it in Russia and it led to that, and they tried it in China and it led to that, and they tried it in Vietnam and it led to that. If you won't stand up to the myth of the 20th century and admit what Russia and China used to be and who made them what they are today, if you won't stand up to the lies of anti-communism, if you won't do it, you sound like a fool. And these people do sound like a fool. Oh, it's not real socialism. Oh, it's not real socialism. You sound like a fucking fool. You're right. He's right about that. And that's why these anti-communists, fake socialists are so dangerous, because they're the best friends. They're all mad. They want us to get mad and fight the Republicans because of Ron DeSantis' anti-communist education law in Florida, right? Ron DeSantis is mandating that this kind of anti-communist, drivel be taught in schools, which it already is anyway. If you go to an American school, this is what you're going to learn, right? He's requiring this. Why are they mad about it? They think the same thing. And they think that me getting on here and challenging it is just genocide denial. They compare this to Holocaust denial if you question it in any way. Why is Vosh mad about Ron DeSantis' law? It just is requiring people to learn exactly what he teaches, exactly what he promotes. And you're right. I mean, if what he is saying about communism were true, he would be 100% correct, but it ain't true. And the people who agree with it, as much as they might draw from Marx for a quote here or there, they ain't Marxists. They're liberals. They're postmodernists. They're anti-communists. They're in favor of U.S. regime change wars. They defend the global free market system. They defend the big bankers and corporations. They refuse to allow anyone to question mainstream media in their wars. They refuse to let anyone question big pharma and their lies. I'm sorry, but the so-called left that agrees with everything he's saying there, but thinks somehow they're still socialists so they could apply it better, they are completely toxic, and they're the best friends he ever had. They are the best friends he ever had. They finally meet socialists, and they agree with him. They agree with this narrative. So there you go. I mean, I agree with him there, right? That if you accept the myth of the 20th century, the idea that socialism never accomplished anything, that everywhere it just made life worse, which it very, very clearly didn't. If you accept that, he's got a point.
That's what you mean when you say that. And, they say, and there's an idea in the New Testament that there's a sin, it's the sin against the Holy Ghost. If you commit that sin, no one really knows what it is, that you can't be forgiven. And I would say, well, if you want a candidate for the sin against the Holy Ghost in the 21st century, the statement, real communism was never tried, with the underlying idea that if you had been the person implementing it, it would have worked, I think that's a pretty good contender for something for which you should never be forgiven.
Interesting that he uses religious imagery there, isn't it? Very interesting. He's referring to the New Testament, etc. But let's start out the video at the beginning. Now, I wanted to show you how he starts the video, because this is interesting. This is how the video starts.
Now, Nietzsche said back in the late 1800s, that after he said that God was dead, and I suppose that would also mean the theory of suffering that I outlined at the beginning, that is at the basis of Judeo-Christian civilization, that God was dead and that people had killed him and that we'd never find enough water to wash away the blood. It's a paraphrase, but I've got the basic message right. And he also said there'll be two consequences of that: nihilism, because there's no transcendent meaning, and a move to totalitarianism because people can't tolerate nihilism.
All right. He's quoting Friedrich Nietzsche. All right. Now I want to read you what Friedrich Nietzsche said. This is the best critique. This is the standard, the most widely promoted critique of Friedrich Nietzsche. George Lukács, The Destruction of Reason. And this is what Nietzsche, this is a quote from Nietzsche. He said, "Whom do I hate most among the rabble of today? The socialist rabble, the Chandala disciples, undermining the workers' sound instincts, good spirits, and sense of contentment, making him envious and instructing him in vengeance. Injustice never lies in unequal rights. It lies in the claim to equal rights. We have killed the outright instincts, enabling the worker to exist as a class, enabling the worker himself to exist. We have taught him military efficiency and given him the coalition right in the political vote. So why be surprised if now the worker is already regarding his condition as a depraved one? But I ask once more, what is it we want? If we want some end in view, we must also wish for the means. If it is slaves we want, we are fools to raise them as masters." That's Friedrich Nietzsche. His critique of socialism is it makes working class people think they're equal to their masters. That's his critique of socialism. He makes it gives working class people the notion that they have just as much right to life, they have just as much human dignity as their bosses do. Right? That I just read you there. He says, if it is slaves we want, we are fools to raise them as masters. He's blaming socialism, which he hates so much, on democracy and on Christianity. That's Friedrich Nietzsche, right? The idea is that democracy and the Western civilization has made the mistake of treating working class people like human beings and telling them that they have equal rights. So that's who he's quoting right there. But it gets better because, he ends by quoting the New Testament and the Bible. This is what Friedrich Nietzsche said about Christianity. Quote, "Christianity is the revolt of all groveling creatures against that which has stature. This kind of gospel of the lowly makes for lowliness." Did you hear that? That's Jordan Peterson is reading to you an expert on communism. Nietzsche. He's quoting Nietzsche as an expert on communism. And Nietzsche considers Christianity to be a revolt of groveling creatures against that which has stature. The gospel of the lowly making for lowliness. That is Friedrich Nietzsche. That's Friedrich Nietzsche, right? This elitist who not only did he oppose communism, but opposing communism led him to oppose democracy and Christianity, which he believed to be the source of communism. Friedrich Nietzsche rejected all moral law, all sense of right and wrong. He believed that there were some men that were inherently superior to others, right? And he believed that some were naturally superior to others, and that the law of the jungle was the natural state of being. And this is what he believed. He said the criminal type is the strong type under favorable conditions. A strong man rendered sickly. What he lacks is the jungle, a certain freer and more dangerous form of nature, an existence where all that serves as arms and armor and the strong man's instinctive view is his by right. His virtues society has prohibited. The liveliest impulses he has borne within him are quickly entangled with the cursing emotions of suspicion, fear, and ignominy. In our civilized world, we are almost solely acquainted with the stunted criminal, weighed down by society's curse and contempt, mistrusting himself, also often belittling and culminating his own deeds, a failed criminal type. We find it repugnant to think that all great men were criminals, but in grand manner, not miserably, that crime belongs to greatness. All right? Kindliness is connected with a lessening of vital powers. This is Friedrich Nietzsche. This is a person who embraced the idea of human beings becoming sadistic, cruel, depraved beasts. Behind all the noble breeds, there is no mistaking the beast of prey, the magnificent blonde beast in greedy search of spoils and conquest. It is the noble races that have left the word barbarian in their tracks whenever they proud. Even the highest culture betrays this awareness and their pride in that fact. Right? And he's praising imperialism because imperialism, capitalism in its monopoly stage, is getting rid of all this Christian morality and all this right and wrong nonsense and all this idea that people should treat each other with kindness and compassion. And he sees socialism as the greatest threat, and he blames socialism on both democracy and the notion of equal rights and on Christianity. This is Friedrich Nietzsche, right? This is Friedrich Nietzsche. This is who he is quoting. He's quoting as an expert on communism, right? I mean, if that's a sign that this man should not be listened to, the fact that he got all of his history wrong, and then on top of that, his philosophical basis is someone who wants to destroy all morality, and considers Christianity to be, evil because it supports the downtrodden and the oppressed, and doesn't glorify strength. I think that is all you really need to know about Jordan Peterson. That is Jordan Peterson. Anyone who claims to love Nietzsche, and quote Nietzsche on socialism, he's not only is he attacking communism, he's attacking democracy and he's attacking Christianity. So if you want to be a Satanist, listen to Jordan Peterson, right? If you want to be a straight up Satanist who opposes not just communism, but democracy and Christianity, who rejects all moral law, who embraces barbarianism, who embraces might is right and the law of the jungle, the ruthless criminal, the rule of the criminal element. That's what Nietzsche argues for, and that's the basis of Nietzsche's anti-communism. So you want to talk about something that that's Jordan Peterson for you. Hate to be dark here, but there you go. But that's my critique of the Jordan Peterson video.